great pleasure to introduce Professor Phil Kotler. Thanks very much, Phil.
Greetings, everyone. I want to start with two questions. The first is, how old is marketing? And the second is, how old is social marketing? So, how old is marketing? Now, you can go back to Adam and Eve, and you know there's a certain sales situation in Adam and Eve. So, let's say sales and selling is very old. There was no use of the word marketing until the 1900s. The first time we saw that term, by the way, the term market is old, goes way back to the ancient Greeks, just the marketplace. But it started we started to see textbooks called marketing written by disillusioned economists who thought there was more to influencing demand than changing the price of something. They recognized that advertising is lifting demand and sales force is lifting demand. And so marketing is about 110 years old. So it's a new field. Social marketing, how old is social marketing? Someone said 42, good. Then I'm not presumptuous in saying that it started with an article that Jerry Zaltman and I wrote in 1971. So we're really celebrating the 42nd birthday today of social marketing. Although I would allow that there were people doing social marketing before that article appeared with respect to problems like population, family planning, and smoking and other things. I think what got Jerry and myself interested in this is we were interested in making the world better through marketing. But in that time, what Jerry and I meant before writing the article is by doing good commercial work. Marketers should feel the dignity of making a contribution because we're creating more goods and services for people to use and enjoy. So let's say it is the purpose of marketing to create a better world. But then Jerry and I began to think about the problem of drugs, the problem of smoking, overeating, obesity, and family planning. And we said, maybe marketing can make a contribution in that way too. So we began to write the article, and the subtitle was A Planned Approach to Social Planning, or something like that. It's an approach to planned change. I better get the word change in a couple of times. And it was not about unplanned social change, it was about planned social change. So social marketing, what it really lacks and still needs, comes out of this expression, creating a better world through marketing. So what's a better world? What are we trying to maximize? At least the economists have the idea that their whole field is about, at least corporate economics, how do you maximize profits? I guess we could talk about maximizing social profits too, but I think what we need is a central word, and I think yesterday there was an excellent talk about different ways to talk about happiness and other things, and maybe it's well-being. The word wellness came up. Maybe we're all in the business of contributing to well-being, and there's a whole history of that concept. There used to be in the 80s a lot of work on what was called social indicators. In other words, we would look at a nation and try to see how its health status, its educational status. By the way, we're getting very upset in the United States to discover that we're not number one in so many important things, like students abroad, especially in Asia and in Finland and some places. they really perform mathematically. We're maybe 15 or 20 in the rankings of our students with things like math and science and so on. And our health system is supposed to be one of the best in the world. We got ourselves to believe that. But it's the most expensive way to get a health system with outcomes that are not better than many other countries in terms of their outcomes. So we're learning. So I want to get into this question of the larger context for social marketing, because we should put some boundaries around anything we do. For example, is the Occupy Wall Street movement that took place, is that social marketing? Or is that a social movement? And we'll try to put a broader context around what is social marketing. Now, the reason for these two books is because they cover two very important areas. One is public health, and the other is protecting the environment. And as projects, we need people to put together for each aspect of the society the best we know. Any one author could have put a great book out on public health, and another author a great book out on environment. So what we decided to do originally was going to be more like finding the best articles that have been written, because that's a typical type of reader. It's a reader book. You just choose the very best things that have been said and put them together. We did something else where we said, no, we want to have original articles written, and we know who the experts are. So when it comes to public health, we know who can write bring us best up to date with an article that would be written for us for this special occasion on, let's say, obesity as a problem and some of the other topics on that. In the case of the environment book, we actually went to good cases that had been written up of real exploits to improve the environment, and then we redid the cases. We went to the people who wrote the cases. We started to get new data, and so it was, again, original writing rather than just a reader, and I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Now, let's go to this question of the context. There's 6 things I want to distinguish, and the rest of my talk is to go into each one and show you how each one differs from, there's only one that is about social marketing. And the first one that we start with is laissez-faire. And laissez-faire is not a marketing kind of thing. It really says let the system run the way it is. Be libertarian in thinking about what's happening. Don't try to influence other people. The system, leave people with liberty to do whatever they want. They want to be heavy and rather than slim, if they want to smoke. So we should start with what is a libertarian position and so on. Actually, I had a conversation with a libertarian recently, and he says, I think all this social marketing, you have no right to do that. It's unethical. You're interfering with my beliefs, my practices. Why don't you just mind your own business? And so on. So there's that quality in laissez-faire too. So let's move on to something that isn't laissez-faire, where it's already beginning to manifest the interest of us as social beings in influencing other people. And I'll say that this is very common. We'll call it social persuasion. It's not yet social marketing. It's usually not heavily communication-oriented. It doesn't understand a full context of how people behave and react to situations. It just sort of says we're going to give some arguments for a certain kind of behavior. And so in terms of the 4P idea, product, price, place, and promotion, social persuasion is just working with 1P, promotion. And yet it has a role to play. We see it in public service announcements. The Advertising Council of America will have nice posters about save, who's the bear again, that so we don't have forest fires, Smokey the Bear, and things like that. And there's one, those ads are very helpful to see. A lot of short messages, don't drink when driving. The conclusion is that they have some role to play, but probably doesn't change much behavior. It's not really focused. Behavior is more going to be more about lots of other things than simply hearing a message. So we'll move on to a thing we could call social innovation. And there, maybe I should have called it social technology. There, maybe we can change behaviors without face-to-face persuasion by creating systems that help people avoid bad behaviors. For example, we can measure breath, alcoholic breaths, and maybe anyone going into a car who just drank a lot can't start the car. How do we get people to wear their seatbelt? Do you remember the cars that actually automated the belt going around you? I don't know why that stopped. Maybe we found that enough people were going to do it on their own, so we didn't have to have it done for them. Car alarms will ring when you get too close to another car. This is going to be especially important because now we're getting into driverless cars that ought to be probably ringing all the time as you get close. Car phones programmed to ring and remind you to take a pill. The physicians tell me that the level of compliance with pills that people are supposed to take is about 40%. So how do we help people? And we could actually have medical offices have a phone system relationship to the patient where it actually phones the patient about taking a pill, or their cell phone does. Additional reminders, prompts, nudges. There's a field emerging in somewhat contrast to the 4 Ps. We think, Nancy Lee and I think that everything can be put under product, price, place, and promotion. And the other side says, no, there's a set of things that don't easily get into there, and you'd rather think about putting prompts that sort of trigger an interest in a behavior, a nudge, where you create the way you even create the architecture of choice, as it's called, may lead people to make better choices. So social innovation is the term I use. We could have called it micro-social engineering, social design, social architecture. But let's move on. So what makes up social marketing? Well, the original message was it's all about trying to influence behavioral change, or maybe behavioral maintenance, maintaining a certain behavior or changing a certain behavior, but the idea was behavior. And to say, there was a little difference between saying I want the capability to change someone's behavior, or I want the capability to influence a change in their behavior. And the benefits, we learned a lot from commercial marketing, which is very active in trying to influence purchases and attitudes. Now, how many social marketers are there? And I threw in a wild number, 10,000. I don't think it's ever been measured. I think there's 500. I know there's 500 social marketers because we have visible evidence of that here. But we know that there are many people working in many countries doing what we would define as social marketing. They're preparing campaigns, and so many governments are wanting us to, eat more sensibly and exercise. So there must be a lot of people, whether they're self-consciously calling themselves social marketers or not, they are busy doing this. And of course, we had made some forays historically into organizations like the World Bank, the Center for Disease Control, the United Nations. In other words, the term social marketing came up at different times in these institutions. And I just yesterday talked with some of you and found out we sort of lost mentions now. It's not like we're actively mentioned. And maybe it's the word marketing that still is the turnoff. And they're doing social marketing, but without the word. I'm sure that's happening. The speaker yesterday, who's from Brazil, said that there's a lot of resistance because even the word marketing is a bad word in Brazil, not just social marketing. I mean, the word marketing means maybe some manipulator is coming your way to guide your preferences. So there's so many issues that have already been researched in our field. It's wonderful to have this listserv capability. Every other day I see someone saying, I'm trying to get some evidence on campaigns against obesity, and where do any of you in this wide world, can you point me to some things to look at? So we're at a good stage in social marketing, and I think we all understand what it is. So let's move on. Let's continue a little bit. If we were to change the name social marketing, and the reason this might have come up is social media. Who ever thought in 1971, when we called something social marketing, that it now would there would be a new term called social media coming up, and some social media people are saying, I do social marketing. But they mean they they're good at media. So if that's a bad confusion, maybe we have to call this cause marketing. Social cause marketing. But let's leave that as a nice discussion in groups whenever you get together. What is the relationship between social marketing and health communications? Well, health communications should be more limited because it sounds like it's just a communication approach without trying to develop better products and prices and places and all that. In talking to Craig Lefebvre just recently, he went abroad and was talking, I guess, in Israel. And what they asked him for is, Craig, don't come here and tell us about social marketing, but we have a problem. What's the problem? It's health promotion. We want to improve our health promotion. We don't mean through advertising, but promoting better health. So that was the door that led to him coming, and then he introduces social marketing. So maybe if you may say that you're a person working on health, on promoting better health, then of course you talk in terms afterwards about what is social marketing. Isn't that the agency that could help us achieve that? And now we have an International Social Marketing Association, a European Social Marketing Association, and so on. And that relates to another thing that's happening. Have you heard of the World Marketing Summit? Let me say that in 2012, in Dhaka, Bangladesh, we had 60 speakers on sort of social marketing. Namely, we met as 60 speakers and an audience of 4,000 people in Bangladesh to help them work on their problem of poverty and hunger and poor education and women's rights, all the things that the United Nations cites in the Millennial Development Goals, goals established by the United Nations and voted on by all the nations positively, 8 goals to make the world a better place. Unfortunately, the financial collapse set us back because one of the goals was to cut poverty in half, and another goal was to cut hunger in half. So we didn't make it because it was supposed to be achieved by 2015. So when we met in Bangladesh, we were reviving the interest in addressing such problems, and that was called the World Marketing Summit. And there's going to be one in 2013 in Kuala Lumpur, and there will be the next one in 2014 in Bangkok. Bangkok will be the permanent home of the World Marketing Summit. So I mentioned this to say that we're allies, we're partners. You're doing World Social Marketing Conference. There are some issues you look at that we don't feature, but they're so important. I mean, how do we stop kids from bullying others in play yards? How do we do a lot of very specific issues? We're not into that so much as sticking to how marketing and social marketing can help in big issues like poverty and health, better education, women's rights, and so on. Okay. The great contribution that Alan Andreessen made in stretching our thinking, because there was a stage where we were just focusing on how to help an individual eat better, exercise more. Downstream social marketing, which is still maybe the heart of what many of your interests are. But there's horizontal social marketing or peer-to-peer social marketing. How can we reach our neighbors and so on? And then there's upstream social marketing. How can we influence the institutions that affect us with food, let's say, and that would be, of course, the school systems and the restaurants and the producers of food. All of you know about that development, and maybe we should be moving more toward some upstream work and seeing what we can do. And why do I say that? Because look at these problems. Overfishing. Sometimes you're going to want to order grouper as a fish, and then you find out, well, they've sort of closed grouper down because the supply is getting very limited. So for a few more months, there's no grouper around. Water pollution, forest destruction, and therefore we are saying maybe our audiences are legislators, associations, companies, social activists. And by the way, there's some people who are more active and activistic in their social marketing. Saul Alinsky ought to be reread a dozen times for how he helped organize groups to fight pollution and bad credit systems and so on and so forth. Ralph Nader and Galbraith. So we have a lot of examples of what you might call upstream social marketing, though I might actually say that they're more into social movements. At least Saul Alinsky would have been. We'll get to that. There's distinctions to be made between what is advocacy and what about lobbying and some other things, but time doesn't permit us looking at these adjacencies. These are things related to our work. And they say, how do we use advocacy? How do we use lobbying? So what is a social movement? How do we say that there's something beyond social marketing, namely the creation of a social movement? And we know of social movements, collective bargaining, we know environmental movement, the gay rights movement, and so on and so forth. I'm going to illustrate one that I worked on, and I wrote a paper, got it published in the Harvard Business Review, called Consumerism, when you may recollect that there were very angry consumers back in the 70s, and there was a movement. There were marches. Believe it or not, there were consumers marching against companies. And how does a social movement take place? I mean, none of us basically are maybe ambitious to make whatever you're doing into a whole social movement. That means you're creating a body of people to, well, as in the one about Wall Street too. But in any case, for a social movement to come about, at least the one called the consumerism, there had to be some readiness for a society to even consider it as a problem. And it was our advancing incomes, it was our advancing technology, and our exploitation of the environment sort of made some country, in this case the United States, maybe Canada to some extent, ready to be even thinking that such a movement makes any sense. But then it was the strains. There were economic strains. Inflation was high. There was social discontent over war and race, ecological discontent. The marketing system itself produced some shoddy products, some gimmicks, and some dishonesty. So usually a social movement, to be fertile, to start, there has to be a lot of frustration in the system. That's not enough. You got to articulate what it's about. Somehow you have to put a voice together on what we represent as a movement. And that voice is usually supplied by writers. Notice that was the time when we had Rachel Carson talking about the silent spring, namely water, our streams of water were being polluted and so on. And we had Vance Packard talking about the hidden persuaders. Keith Fauver had a big committee, and Senator Douglas raising questions, investigating. Consumer organizations were forming and getting strong. John Kenneth Galbraith wrote about the affluent society, which is a joke in a sense, because while we had personal wealth and affluence, we didn't have any parks to go to, we didn't have any roads we could really drive well on, and so there was this paradox of the public sector being starved and the private sector having affluence. So now it still takes a trigger, a spark. Ralph Nader, and suddenly showing that Ford was spying on him and trying to sabotage him after he published his book, Unsafe at Any Speed. And other things were happening, the housewives picketing and so on. Still nothing happens in a movement unless it goes to another stage, that mass media finds, hey, we can sell more papers with this cause, which, happens, and then some politicians make it their cause. That's important, how to get them behind this. And then these consumer groups. And then the question is, how does business react? How does Congress react? And a movement can die at that point. Or it could be joined by some Congress people and so on. All I'm saying by this illustration on consumerism is that it's almost like 6 different stages you pass through in trying to form a movement. Now, there's one movement I've been trying to think about forming. It's more than social marketing. It would be a peace movement. I was in Saudi Arabia, and my hosts at their home were the bin Ladens. And you'd say, what are you doing with the bin Ladens? Well, I was with the 4 brothers who hate the 5th brother, who we all finally got to. And the bin Ladens are a very respectable construction company, one of the best in the Middle East, and working with Caterpillar, working with everyone else, and building infrastructure. And the youngest son, Mohammed bin Laden, said to me, you know, you've done a lot of work with campaigns, but there's one subject you've never tackled. And I said, well, what could that be? Peace. You haven't ever addressed the need for a peace movement. And that is true, because when we observe that, once in a while, before a country might go to war, there will be a peace march against it. Or after the war is won, there will be an incipient but very temporary movement to celebrate the peace and to make it a movement around the world. But it just never seems to go far. One of the best initiatives recently is done by William Ury. He wants to bring together Christians, Muslims, and Jews to share their common heritage, which is from Abraham. In a sense, it's called the Abrahamic path and so on. And people volunteer to go and walk with people from other faiths, following where the Bible told the stories that took place. But if any of you, I think if we're going to build a peace movement, we have to do it with conflict resolution skills and community building skills. It's maybe one community at a time, but that would be far beyond what we do in social marketing, though we would have the same wish to make a better world. I'm going to now end with roughly the social conditioning approach, which could have been called social engineering. There is the way of thinking that we will engineer better behaviors by actually training children when they're born to be much more, to be better people. And we remember that certainly a religion tries to play a social engineering role, if you want to put it that way. Namely, it gives you the precepts and the rituals and the practices that will make you into a good human being according to those religious precepts. But it even took a psychological approach under behaviorism, which was a theory based on learning, and learning by rewards and punishment, basically, by what they call operant conditioning. So that going way back to Pavlov and how he could train a dog to do anything in connection with a bell ringing. He can ring a bell and the dog will salivate because he'll know he's been trained to know that means he's about to eat. But B.F. Skinner went the furthest to try to raise his own child in what was called an air crib. So everything would be engineered to produce a child who was a very good child. But then it gets to the very bad side when it becomes the National Socialism movement in Germany, or Soviet communism, or Taliban. And so this goes both ways, this what we call social conditioning. So the final question that I'd like to leave you with is this, if I can get back to that. There we go. Should social marketing stay where it is mainly, which is, I think, still downstream? And please, if you're doing good downstream work, wonderful, keep it up. Or should we start putting a little more into upstream? And what about inventing technologies that help people behave better without them being coerced or persuaded? And then how about our relationship to social movements? There's a blurry line between social marketing and social movements, and what about social conditioning? So I'll stop here, and thank you very much for listening to me.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Again, I think we've got time for a few questions now. So again, could you raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. Any questions, points, challenges you'd like to raise? Okay, can we actually go over here? We'll come back. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Monica Pierce, and I'm at Rare. I think you raised a really interesting point about why there hasn't yet been a social movement for peace. And I'm wondering if the case is because a lot of these environments are in unstable conditions. Do you recommend a safe way to have some sort of social marketing campaign for peace in an area that might have a lot of violence and conflict?
In a sense, that's where this peace movement should start, in the midst of a place where there's already such conflict that the only thing that's sensible is to work and negotiate and settle it down and avoid further conflict. I think the problem is that whoever's starting a peace movement there is going to be killed probably, because there's too much, each side thinks it's going to gain from war rather than peace. And then if it happens in a peaceful place about a war situation in another place, there's no connection between the two. The peace marchers feel good to represent and stand for something, but it doesn't have any effect on the war. So I think it goes back to conflict resolution and how we can I love the book called Getting to Yes, which is a negotiation approach which should take the two sides and get to their interests rather than to their personalities and their histories of bad feelings toward each other. You can take one more question, maybe?
Yeah, I think we'll do just one more. Was there another one over here? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Lyons from the University of Waterloo. I have about 20 students here with me today. Maybe you could put up your hands if you're a student. Don't have to be from the University of Waterloo, but just in general. There should be about 20 hands up, or else you're in trouble. All right, okay, that's good. I teach social and green marketing, marketing of sustainability. I was just wondering, I guess my question for you is, and you've talked about a lot of things to read, what Kotler or non-Kotler reading would you recommend for students to either inspire them to get interested in social marketing, or about your last question, like where should social marketing go?
Yeah. As far as reading, Nancy Lee and I published the 4th edition of Social Marketing, and the 5th is now under preparation. So I think that's a good start. If you want another view, a fantastic book just came out from Craig Lefebvre about his social marketing. He's been working in this field for a long time, and I would recommend that. That's maybe a larger book and much more into a lot of depth about how the field is working. So those are 2 readings, and maybe get them into some aspect like the health or the education aspect too. As far as where we should be, how do we do upstream more? There you're going to have more skills in lobbying, because remember, I've always defined lobbying as a marketing exercise. The target market happens to be legislators. And we know a lot about every single legislator. We know what they eat for breakfast. There's a handbook almost that you can find somewhere in Washington that will tell you that the hot button to get Senator X to be even available, but to be interested in issue Y, is the following. So lobbying skills, and then I think we have to use more PR, public relations, because the media still is conditioning our thinking about what are the what are the issues we're all facing. And even representatives, when they see something hot, they're going to have to take a position on it. So we may force positions by a lot of good PR and lobbying work. But thank you again. We're all for change, good change. Thank you.